your jobs and you go out in the world, you're likely not going to find a program like Reggie's in your school. I didn't find it at my school. We had an after-school program. We still have it. It's okay. There's a teacher who stands up there and teaches things about anger, but it's very passive. And what I love about Reggie's program is that he actually has the kids in group, and they have to process, they have to share, they have to talk about what's going on with them. And it's really interesting because the first group that we had in Reggie's group, we had to round those kids up because it was their intervention. They didn't want to go. And after the second time that they were in Reggie's class, they were told, you know, you can leave if you want. Do you know how many kids left? Out of like 22? 0. Because they all recognized that they were lacking the tools to cope with their lives. They all understood that Reggie could teach them something that they did not have, and they were not getting through successfully in life, and they wanted his program. And at the end of the first cohort, which is 8 weeks long, I had a line of kids out of my office saying, can I please stay in for the next group? I know I really need it. And I had a co-facilitator come in and say, this kid just finally started sharing after 7 weeks. He just sat there and he finally started talking about what's going on with him, and we really want to keep him in. So Reggie's group's grown and grown and grown. So right now I'm writing the grant for next year, and I'm trying to expand it. I'm advocating that we do this on a district level. Like I said, my dream is to have this all over America because I think we need it, and we're not teaching our kids how to cope when they're dealing with a lot of this trauma and things going on in their own lives. Basically, my goal is that we no longer mirror our prison systems, because we have a very broken prison system where we incarcerate. We put people in prison, they come out, they reoffend, they go back in. And it's just this, spin cycle. And this is what schools are doing as well. And so my goal is that one day that we have more emotional literacy, that we help our kids who really need it. Because mental health funding is always, up there with the arts and things. That's the first to go. And we're not helping these kids. We're just pushing them into it's actually, there's a term for it, and it's on your references here. It's the school to prison pipeline. It's actually a pipeline, and it's tremendously horrible. So if you want to check that out. The other thing is we have 2 kids from my school who both have really long discipline records. And they've overcome their issues, and they're amazing kids. And as Pat said, it's not just me. There's a big group of us who refuse to give up on our at-risk kids because we think they're of value. We think that they are, amazing people, and they have a lot to contribute to our society and our school. And there's another really great story on our February podcast at www.rbvhs.org. There's a great story on there if you want to hit that website from one of our students who is also in Reggie's program. It's about his experience getting jumped into a gang pretty early and then exiting out of that gang life. And so that's a very powerful story. But basically, the next step is we're going to give you guys the solution. So I've given you the problem. I made you aware of the scary statistics in the world that you're about to walk into. But there are amazing solutions. And so Reggie's going to talk about his solution, working with the kids, what he's teaching the kids. And then Ben, who just came in, raise your hand, Ben's over there. Ben's going to talk about the solution from your perspective, what you guys can do in your classrooms with these kids. All righty? So that's all I got. Any questions? Do you have questions?
First of all, I want to thank you guys for allowing me to come in here and have this opportunity and just give you guys some good information about some of the youth that you guys are going to be working with in the next coming month or years whenever you guys start your guys' process. What I want to do is give you just a little background about myself. Externally, you'll look at this individual and you'll say, okay, he seems like he's okay. I went to Mission Bay High School. I excelled in wrestling. I also went to Morris High School, where I was what you consider an A and B student. And I actually graduated from high school, and I had an opportunity to actually go into the Navy as an electronic technician because my test scores were so high, actually. But that was just the external part of Reginald Washington. There was another part that I didn't really speak about, and that was my home life. As a child, one of the first traumatic situations that happened to me is that I was molested as a child. I never told anyone. It was something that I kept to myself, and it was because of that shame, it was because of that embarrassment that I acted out a lot of times. I was an individual who almost felt like I needed to be befriended by those who were around in my community. And I remember the first time that my mother had asked me to go get some milk around the corner. And when I went to go get that milk, I saw individuals just hanging outside of the store, and they looked cool. They seemed like they were respected individuals. And one of the things that I noticed more than anything, there was sort of like a glare about them. You know, they were shining, so to speak. You know, I had no idea that these individuals couldn't even spell cat. I had no idea that the respect that I really thought that I had for them was actually fear. You know, we've heard that old saying, in Rome, do as the Romans do. I talked to some of my kids about that, and they always like, what does that mean, Reggie? Well, for us who know, well, if you don't do as the Romans do, you get fed to the lions. They didn't understand that part of what I was saying. So me personally, in my community, I felt like I was in Rome, so I did as the Romans did because I didn't want to get fed to the lions, so to speak. So it was hard for me to really speak about some of the issues that were happening in my life. You know, as a kid, I felt like if I told my mother that I would have probably been to blame. I felt like as a kid that, you know, it was something that I did wrong. Well, these things right here actually put me in a situation where my self-esteem had went down low. And you guys remember that chart that Shannon just put up, that was like the second or third thing, building up of the self-esteem. Well, mine was all the way down because of what had happened to me. But more importantly, I had something that I talked to my kids about, is I had a sick need to be accepted by people. And I call it sick because I was that individual that I would get high just to fit in. I would get involved in violent acts just to fit in. And when I went to school, you know, it was almost like a safe haven for me. It actually was, because I didn't have to deal with the alcoholism that was going on in my family at that time. I didn't have to, you know, speak about the emotional abuse that was going on in my house. I would just be able just to do what I was supposed to do in school, play kickball or whatever the case may be. And that was easy for me. I didn't know that I was really just starting to stuff my feelings. See, because I was an individual who, I lacked emotional literacy skills. As I started growing up, I remember the first incident that happened to me that somewhat traumatized me in my school arena. It was a meeting, and my mother had came to school, and she was drunk. And I remember a kid said something about it, and as soon as he did, boom, punched him right in the face. I got in trouble for fighting at school. I didn't even deal with the embarrassment. I didn't deal with the, you know, feeling a little bit odd because my mother had came to school like that. I remember from that day on, I never told my mother about PTA meetings. I never told her about parent gatherings or anything like that. So on the outside, what it looks like is, oh, Reggie's parents aren't involved with what's going on with Reggie. Little did they know that I grabbed a note or whatever and I would just throw it away. So that was the first sign, you know, that teachers should look at, the involvement with the parents and the per se student that's there. Well, anyway, as I grew up, some of the things that I took from that first time of using violence, I actually just put that as a part of my life. So here's the first thing that I learned in a backwards way. I actually thought that anger and violence went together. I thought if you got angry, you got violent. I thought that's how you dealt with this specific emotion. So now when you gather that type of skill, what has happened is certain other emotions were going on inside me. When I talked about embarrassment, well, for me, embarrassment also led to sadness, depression, disappointment. And now, just like when I had anger, I dealt with it by violence. Well, now, when I have disappointment, I dealt with it by getting high. I dealt with it by drinking. This is how I dealt with these specific emotions. So when I use that term emotionally illiterate, what it actually means is that I didn't have the ability to deal with these certain emotions, and this is how I dealt with them. Well, what's going on in our schools today is our kids are doing the same thing. When they get angry, they get violent. And I remember being in the classroom and I tell part of my story and I ask the kids, like, when you get angry, who else gets violent? All the kids raise their hand. Then I ask another question. When you find yourself disappointed or depressed, do you also drink or get high? All the students said yes. This is how they're dealing with those emotional outbursts, those emotions. So what I tend to do is focus first of all on that. Excuse me. But now back to my story. Since this is how I dealt with emotions, I was on a crash course to prison. And I didn't know how it was going to come about. But what actually happened, because I dealt with since I didn't have no emotional literacy skills, I was a prime candidate for gangs. I mean, it wasn't even hard to recruit me. Remember, I had a sick need to be accepted by people. Remember that I lacked self-esteem. Remember, I dealt with anger with violence. Remember, I was the individual who had no problem getting high because I didn't want to deal with the disappointment. Well, you know, you look at, excuse me, you look at that scenario, and all you have to do is just have an individual say, hey man, if you don't do that, man, you're scared. Well, I want to fit in, I'm going to do it. So it was easy for me to be put in this situation where I thought that I was being loved. Now, what do we have now is that we have kids similar to my past, but they're at a higher level now. Now, remember, part of my story is, man, I actually graduated from high school. Even through all the turmoil that I went through, even through all the stress and all the disappointment in my life, I still made it to a graduate at high school level. And partly because school was safe for me. And when I look at the terms of the school system today, and I know as principals and assistant principals, you guys are doing the best that you guys can. I understand that. But I also remember that there was a teacher that pulled me to the side and said, Reggie, what's going on with you? It was that one teacher that did that put me on the course to redeem myself 20 years down the line. See, when she did that at that day, it was something that was planted inside me, and it blossomed 20 years later. And it's funny when I say blossomed 20 years later because during those 20 years later, unfortunately, you know, I was one of those individuals who had a life sentence in prison already. See, the other part of my story is I got so angry that I shot 4 people one night. I never made it home. September 29th, 1990, I shot 4 people because I was angry. And I used the only skill that I had when I got angry, which is violence. From 1990 to 2005, I spent a third of my life in prison under the term of 15 years to life for 4 attempted murders. They called it gang-related. I call it emotionally illiterate related, which is just the facts. I didn't know how to deal with those emotions. It's funny because I didn't look at the damage that I did on my way to prison. I had a young lady that was following me. She was my girlfriend. She's dead. I had a daughter who was inside her at that time. She was born, and when she came, she had a mother that was on drugs, and she had a father that was in prison. Before she turned 8, her mother was dead, and I still had a life sentence in prison. So when we hear these stories about grandparents raising grandsons and granddaughters, I know from that experience. I know the experience of raising my daughter through telephones and letters. I know the experience of being inside prison and finally having an understanding what I did, not just to myself, but to others. See, when Shannon talks about Project Aware, Aware actually stands for something. Aware stands for Attitude when Angry and Resolving Emotional Issues nonviolently. That program was created in prison to work with young teens who are coming